You ready now? Final one, home stretch. Okay, let's roll. Welcome to our final episode in the Mental Health Awareness Month that we've been running every Friday of October. Maybe you're seeing this after the fact. It's still going to be great content. Anyway, it's our final episode. I see you both dressed up nice and smart.
I know. I wore my jacket for the first time in the series.
Corporate
you
edition.
Wore your jacket at the same time. We need to introduce ourselves, by the way. Don't forget that.
That's Mark.
Hi there. And this is Theron.
Migro CEO. I'm Theron, the Migro CHO. Figure out what that means. Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at we're in the final episode, as I said. Let's quickly just do a recap of some of the stuff that we looked at in the previous episode. Okay, so Mark, do you remember this Harvard study? Can you talk us through these stats that have come up recently?
Yeah, I was so glad you shared this, Theron, because this came up in some of the research you were actually doing with the psych department. And this is from the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise, SHINE. And they did the study across 17 different countries. Sample size not too big, but 1,200.
Industries. 17 industries.
Sorry, 17 industries.
Should I talk to it? You
can go.
Can you carry on? Carry on.
So 1,271 people participated in the study. So not like a massive global sample, but I mean a big enough sample size. And just some of the findings were very interesting in terms of specifically workplace well-being through this pandemic period. You can see the study there done in 2020. 56% of people experiencing like a decrease in a sense of control around work, 45% increase in loneliness in relation to work relationships, 60% worsened social relationships is what people were experiencing, and a 35% increase in depression. And I just looked at this study and these stats, and it just says to me that there's this kind of massive downhill journey that people are experiencing in their workplace relationships.
And let's not forget, this was specifically the findings, the way they brought the findings out, the way they interpreted and made sense of it was that the impact of having our social experience of work being impacted or changed is what's brought out these kind of stats. So it's not just that everyone's struggling with mental health, it's that the impact on the way we work socially is having these kind of results. Yeah. We looked at a couple of answers, or a couple of ways of understanding what's going on. Talked about this drama triangle. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can go and look at that in the previous episode. But we unpacked how this could be a way in which people are actually perpetuating and exacerbating the drama as a result of all of the stuff that we're seeing and experiencing, potentially making us be more passive-aggressive in a digital space or tending to feel more of a victim. So a fascinating model, go check it out. And we looked at the answer to this being the empowerment dynamic, recasting those different roles of victim and persecutor and rescuer into creator, coach, and challenger. Again, some very helpful tips on how you can actually try and change the way you engage with your team. Like, what can we actually do about this? And we gave you a resource in the last episode, the Giving Praise resource, and go check that out on the previous episode if you haven't.
Just amazing testimonies and stories coming through of people using the Giving Praise technique in their team environments, and just such positive impact for people, I think, in a time that's been massively challenging. Yeah,
to try and bolster that positive ratio. We talked about that as well. Instead of the downward spiral, try to build the upward spiral. Yeah. Part of what's been lost in this season is some of our culture, some of the dynamics interpersonally at work have been lost, and we might not even realize that that's happened yet, which means, especially for leaders, the kind of effort and input it takes, it needs to be more than we used to put in. Otherwise, our communication is going to suffer, our collaboration is going to suffer, and essentially our teams are going to become weaker teams. Okay, jumping on to the final slice of our EQ wheel here. Mark, talk to us about decision making. We started at the beginning of the series in stress management there, the blue, and we worked our way all the way around clockwise, and we're finishing now on decision making. What is decision making? Why is it an EQ competency?
Well, I mean, decision making is very interesting because when it comes to decision making, I think there's often this perspective that if you can just create a little profit and loss, a little like positives and negatives,
pros and cons,
you can get your little balance at the bottom and say, oh, there's more pros than cons, let me make that decision. Turns out actually getting to the point of choosing something is actually an emotional intelligence competence. And some of the muscles or the psychological muscles that drive that is the ability for reality testing, one of those components of decision making, to be able to control one's impulses. And I always think of this in terms of, hey, you got the credit card stacked up and there's a sale on at the mall. Do you just buy stuff because it's on sale, or are you able to control your impulses? This is the classic marshmallow experiment, that often goes around in EQ circles. And then problem solving, is there an ability to actually solve problems and use the emotional information one is getting to solve problems effectively?
Now, of course, we know decision making is important. We know it's an important skill. In Migro, we often come back to this phrase from, a couple of sentences actually, more than a phrase, from Alice in Wonderland. I'm going to read it to you here. It's this moment where Alice has come to this crossroads and she doesn't know where to go, and the Cheshire Cat is there. So she says, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" And the cat says, "Well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to." She says, "Oh, I don't much care." And then he says, "Well, it doesn't matter which way you go, so long as I get somewhere," Alice added. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk for long enough." And this has become something we often use when we engage around this content of where you want to go really matters. And if we don't care about where you want to go, then the decision doesn't matter. But if we do have a vision for where we're going, then it really does matter, and we need to make good decisions.
What I love about this quote and what you've included here, Theron, in these yellow lines is often the one I'm familiar with ends up with what the cat says. Then it doesn't matter which way you go. And what gets added here is that way leads onto way. And so, if you just walk it long enough, you're going to end up somewhere in your life. And I think when we look at some of the stats around the sheer volume of decisions that we're faced with every day, you stack those up, you add them up, and suddenly, if you just walk long enough, you end up somewhere. And is it where you want to be?
Yeah. So that's the question. Where do you ultimately want to get to? And this is a question that we're going to be bringing up time and time again in this episode. Where do you want to get to? Is the status quo, is the current moment that you're in, is it perfect? Do you think, oh, great, the new world, if this is the new world, yay? Or do you think, no, I want something different, I want something more? Because the decisions you'll need to make to get there are important, and it's actually a skill you can learn. And we'll get into that in a second. But Mark, talk to us about decision making.
Well, these are just some fun stats or facts about decision making, and actually this is from The Art of Choosing from Sheena Lengar. And she, in some of her research, estimates or shows that there's an estimated 25,000 to 35,000 decisions that one needs to make on a daily basis.
Most of them, of course, looks like subconscious.
Yeah,
if you look
absolutely.
at the below the line there.
Absolutely. I mean, 70% of them we only make consciously. And, some of them would be, you get up to brush your teeth, and do you brush it now or later? Do you make your coffee first or after you brush your teeth, whatever it is? So some of them are just normal, they're part of the routine of our life now. And such a small percentage of them are actually made consciously or mindfully, if you like.
So are we saying that 70 or 70%? 70 of them are conscious.
70 of them are actual conscious decisions.
So 99 point something are subconscious to get up to that 25.
Yeah, a lot. We just actually swept up in our lives, and we just like coping,
or not.
And just getting swept up into what we think we need to do. 35 of these are professional decisions made on a daily basis. These conscious ones. So that's a huge proportion, And then just another study that she showed, which was quite interesting, is that CEOs do an average of 139 tasks weekly, and 50% of their choices they make in 9 minutes or less, and 12% in an hour or more. And so what that means is we've got such a short space of time to make certain very important decisions. If you think about a CEO, and by the way, I think of a mom as a CEO, and so there's some radical decisions that get made that have huge ramifications on a business environment in terms of a work CEO, and on a home environment or kids development in terms of a house CEO. And you've got some very interesting dynamics there in terms of decision making.
Now, what's interesting for me is the difference between those 70 conscious decisions and the 25,000, if we take the lower end of that, subconscious decisions. A lot of those, even though they're subconscious decisions, can be impacted by developing strength around decision making. You can actually impute a little bit of consciousness into the process so that we're not just swept along. Yeah. But we'll get there in a second. Okay. How do decisions work? How are they connected to emotions? This is your field, emotional intelligence. Decision making, as we know, is a core component of EQ. Explain to us how decisions are emotional. I think a lot of the time we could understand some decisions would be emotional, but it seems like it's all decisions that are emotional, at least the conscious ones.
Well, just to start, on the left side here, you can see this picture of a guy with a spike through his head. That was this famous story of a guy, Phineas Gage, kind of railroad accident where the spike literally got shot through his head.
Explosion and...
Yeah. A radical accident, and he ended up being able to function fairly normally, except his decision making became quite problematic. Now, this is a historical study. I can't remember the dates. I think it was 1800s, somewhere there. But there's a more recent study around a guy called Eliot. And this was from, I think, the psychiatrist Antonio Damasio. Am I getting that name right, Theron?
Definitely.
Damasio.
I think it's Eliot that is his patient.
That's it. And Eliot had suffered a stroke in a certain part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You can see it there on the bottom right. This is a part of the brain that literally is between the emotional center of the brain and the frontal lobes. The emotional centers being what are essentially picking up the emotional information, and the frontal lobes, that part of our brain responsible for executive functioning. Can I actually interact and
effectively in the world? Can
exactly, exactly, executive. I can execute something. So anyway, what they found was that if you have a look at that heart picture, that fundamentally, the ability to choose, this is what he found with Eliot. Eliot could get to seeing the difference between option A and option B. He could know that option B was the preferential option. In other
cognitively,
words,
logically.
He could even say, this is the better thing to choose. He could say, for example, in the experiments that Damasio did with him, I want this chocolate B rather than chocolate A. He could describe why he wanted chocolate B rather than chocolate A. But actually getting to the point of choosing it, he wasn't able to do. And if I remember correctly, this guy, Eliot, had been quite a prominent, I think he was a lawyer, some highly qualified person, and he became completely dysfunctional because of a stroke in his brain, in this part of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And what Antonio Damasio was able to show was that emotions are fundamentally and vitally important in the actual choosing part of decision making.
So essentially, he'd lost the ability for his emotions to weigh in on what he should decide.
That's the best way of
saying it. So he could work it out logically.
Yeah.
I remember reading about it actually that he couldn't decide, should I use a blue pen or a black pen? Like completely irrelevant, doesn't matter, but which one should I use? I don't know what to do right now. Don't know what to eat for lunch. Take him hours to choose something off a menu because of the lack of his emotional ability to connect with a decision that he had to make. Yeah. Okay, talk to us about this ASCH conformity study. And what this tells us about external influence on our decision making.
I mean, this gives me shivers every time I look at this study, Theron, because I would like to think of myself as having agency in my life and being able to make choices in my life and run my own life. You know, I don't want to be run by the world or something else. And this ASCH conformity study, very simple. They initially, you can see on the left-hand side there, the two people, they got an individual to come in with another person who was an actor in this experiment, and they were shown two cards. The card on the left at the top there with a line, and they were then asked the question, is the line similar to the lines on the second card, line A, B, or C? Now, if you look at that, it clearly is line A. Line B is far too long, line C is far too short. And less than 1% of people would make a mistake, so basically no one, would make a mistake and say that it is line B or C. It's equivalent to line B or C.
If they were asked in their own capacity with no other external influence.
Well, with just one other person there. With just one other person, so they could go, well, that guy's wrong. I'm going to stick with my option. But then when they brought in a whole lot of other conspirators,
actors,
and they put and they put them in a group of, I think it was 7. There was 7 or 8 other people, or 6 or 7 other people, sorry, my maths was wrong there, that would all choose the wrong answer. So they would come in, the experimenter would go, okay, here's the card on the left. Which line is the same as the card on the right, A, B, or C? Which line is equivalent to this? And everybody else, by the way, the person who was being experimented on was always last in the group, and they didn't know that these were conspirators in the experiment. But 75% of people chose the incorrect answer when they were influenced by their peers. It gives me shivers, because what it says about you and me and those that are listening in is that we can be influenced by what other people are choosing, even if those decisions are incorrect decisions or incorrect choices, blatantly incorrect. It gives me shivers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's phenomenal. I like to think I would be in the 25%. Who knows? Who knows? Yeah, okay. This question that we had at the beginning, where do you ultimately want to go? It's a question that if we can keep coming back to, if we can keep this front and center and ask ourselves this question when we are in a context, perhaps like, as you mentioned in the ASCH conformity study, where the context is saying, choose this, choose that, this is the way to do it. Oh, of course you have to do this. This is the way the world works now. If we're making decisions in those 25,000 minus 70, just subconsciously being washed along, then it's going to make sense that we might just go with whatever. Or even if we're being conscious about it, we may be in that 75% who just goes wherever. But if it matters to us where we want to go, then it matters to us to be able to stay above the context. And the way we deal with that makes a difference. I don't know if you remember, we talked about coping mechanisms, adaptive and maladaptive. Can you just run us through coping mechanisms and how they apply to this moment in terms of a future state and where we want to get to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find this such a helpful graphic, Theron, because it's basically that adaptive coping mechanisms are helpful because they create a future state that leads to a place of well-being, the little smiley face at the bottom there. Where maladaptive coping mechanisms, ways of responding, if you like, to the stress of life or the world or what we currently all are facing, often tends to deal with the current threat. So it's helpful in the current moment, but it leads ultimately long-term to a place of unhappiness. A good example of this might be, I love a glass of wine when I get home, and I realized a few months ago that I was just loving a little bit more glass of wine each evening, and you take that to the extreme, and suddenly, while that might be numbing some of the current moment, you take that to the extreme of alcoholism, and I think we all know that that's maladaptive coping.
Now what's interesting here is this idea of a future state, and especially as we're saying that decision-making is an emotional skill and that emotions are involved. Emotions, we often say emotions are like signposts. They're signposts to give us information in this context of this analogy about where we want to go. But if we are letting current emotion, the emotion in this moment right now, dictate what we're going to do, then we're probably going to be in a maladaptive space. But if we can allow future anticipated emotion, for instance, if I keep working on my night studies, in 3 years' time, I'm going to finally have my degree. I'm going to feel great when that happens, anticipating that future emotion and saying, okay, my decision is to keep studying tonight instead of watching the next 17 episodes of whatever I'm watching on Netflix. Yeah. So this ability to be able to decide by imagining a future state where we want to be is super important. But the way this works in terms of the brain is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive for many people. So can you just walk us through the brain and this relationship between the emotional centers and the cognitive centers?
Yeah, I think, obviously there's some controversy around whether the brain can be separated into the kind of mammalian brain, reptilian brain, etc., etc. I like to just, for expedience sake, think of the brain having certain emotional centers, which we're seeing in the green over here, and then the pituitary gland in red over there, having these frontal lobes that are responsible primarily for executive functioning. And this, by the way, is the part of the brain in humans that is most developed compared to other mammals.
So it's what sets us apart in terms of our mental ability for raw intelligence.
Absolutely. When you talked about emotions being like signposts, it reminded me of, is it Susan David, who is she emotional agility? I think so. Yeah, you introduced me to her. She talks about emotions as being like data points. And I love that, signposts or data points. The problem is if these are disconnected, if we don't take the data points in the emotional centers of the brain and we just allow the data to spew out whatever we do without linking that to our frontal lobes, we end up in a scenario where we just get blown and tossed, like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind in terms of our emotions, and that's obviously equally problematic.
And then our emotions rule us or control us, and we just end up wherever they take us, or wherever the context is leading us.
That's what happened to the kids who couldn't pass the marshmallow experiment and would gobble up the marshmallow immediately, is that they were just totally,
victims of the moment.
Victims of the moment.
Yeah. Victims of their emotion.
Control wasn't there.
Okay, so talk to me about the relationship between these two things. We're in the space of developing EQ. What happens if you develop those muscles in the emotional centers?
Well, what I love about just working in this world of developing EQ is there really is some physiology that works very much like muscles, is the way I think about it, in the neurological space. And so I think of emotional intelligence as being like the ability to balance the emotional centers of the brain and the frontal lobes. And what happens through something like MyGrow, I mean, this is what we do through the platform, is by implementing certain techniques over time, one is creating neurological pathways, kind of like muscles, that allow one to maintain a measure of control, if you like, of the balance between the emotional centers of the frontal lobes. And I love the way you've said it there, that developing emotional intelligence, or developing that ability to balance the two, unlocks our ability for the frontal lobes to work to the maximum.
I mean, we saw this in that thought action repertoire that we showed a couple of episodes back. When we have negative emotion that rules us and rules the moment, it just shuts down our ability to ideate, to collaborate effectively, to see a way forward that's going to be more beneficial. But if we can learn to master that so that our emotions don't control us, but are a vital partner with us in terms of deciding who and how we're going to be in the world, it really unlocks the potential of what the human animal is. I mean, this creature that you and I are, and all of you at home, we are phenomenal what we can do. The difference between us and every other part of the natural order is it is magnitudes apart. You know, I often think of it like this, you know, certain animals are really good at certain things. Goats can balance really well on the mountain, you know, and can jump down these rocky things, you know, whatever. Cheetahs are very good at running very fast, but they've all got one or two things they're good at. Humans can do like so many things, and we can't all do the same things. We have such a potential, but we are trapped and locked. Remember, we talked about that learned helplessness experiment. Another great example of how our psychological and emotional paradigms can lock us and shut us down. So I think something that I'd like to share today, something that the point I'd really like to drive home, is that the benefits of developing emotional intelligence will be really helpful for all the things that we've been looking at with mental health, but it goes well beyond mental health. It goes in towards, you know, success and flourishing in all aspects of life, which brings us back to this question, Mark, of where do we ultimately want to get to? And I mean, we shared right at the beginning that this series was going to be aimed at teams. So perhaps the more poignant question is, where do you ultimately want your team to get to? What kind of team do you want? We talked about these stats before around, you know, the impact that COVID and mental health dynamics have had on teams. Where do you want your team to get to? What kind of team do you want? Do you want these guys here, or do you want these guys here?
All men, hey?
All men. Sorry, there's men all through this season. So how do we move towards the destination we want to get to, Mark?
Yeah.
As a team, as a company, as individuals, in our marriages, in our lives, how do we get there?
Well, I mean, you know, there's a couple of conversations going on in my mind as you say that. The one conversation is just the long-term research that's been done on emotional intelligence as a set of competencies that make people great at managing themselves and interacting with others. And again in the research around the world, EQ is being shown as being this kind of radical set of psychosocial muscles that literally are the differentiator between those who are more or less successful in a similar IQ range. So that's quite, I think, an important conversation to be part of. Another one that I think is important to mention is just some of the massive shifts in the world of work. You know, there's been shifts in generations. You know, there's a whole lot of really young people that are entering senior management levels in organizations, which is unprecedented in the history of organizations that were very bureaucratic. You know, you think of
which means there's a shifting set of values as well. So
Values,
there's this perfect storm of dynamics that are resulting in a very different kind of world. I mean, you're closer to the sales side of the business than I am, so maybe you can jump in here. But I've heard from you guys that are dealing with clients in the sales context that when we ask them what kind of teams do you want, this is a set of words that come out. These are what people say when they come to us to help them. Yeah. Could you speak to any of this in terms of the new world and the felt need?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just looking at some of these, I mean, pick any word, maybe empathetic. You know, clients say, oh, we want teams that are really empathetic, or create a psychologically safe environment for people to be innovative. These are just words that roll off people's tongues. And our question constantly is how? How are you going to develop that?
How are you going to get there?
And what we see again and again is that this set of skills known as collectively as emotional intelligence. I like to think of them as psychosocial muscles. This is the set of skills that results in those things that people want to see in their teams. And so with all these shifts in the world of work happening, leadership needs to change. The way people interact with each other needs to change. Even just the skills that people are primarily looking for. On that previous slide, if people want an empathetic team, there's a different kind of skill set that people need to look for in recruitment, in the way they promote people, in what they are developing, etc., etc.
In fact, we've heard a few different times recently this concept that EQ is the new power skill. It's the skill that's going to be needed in the world. And just to pull us back again to that phrase I said a little while back, it goes so far beyond mental health. I know this moment is a moment of looking at mental health, trying to shine a spotlight on it. And it has been shown that developing these skills will ultimately get us back to where we started in this series, stress management, the ability to manage stress. If this season can be spelled STRESS, like I said right at the beginning in this series, then developing this journey through self-perception, self-expression, building our interpersonal muscles and skills and relationships around us to create a foundation of support, to create a healthy dynamic and context for decision making, then really the moment now that we're at is what decision are we going to make as we look towards that future destination, either left or right at the crossroads. Where do we want to get to? Well, we have agency. We have agency. We can choose. Where do we want to get to? And that's my question for you as we wrap up the series. What kind of team do you want, and what are you going to do to get there? Because if you don't do anything, I think we're just going to be rolled over wave after wave of this virus and this new world that is not what we chose and is not really conducive to our flourishing unless we take charge of the moment. So that's pretty much where I want to end it. Any final words from you today, Mark?
Yeah, what's just coming to mind for me is somewhere through last year when we were doing the first series on mental health, someone said to me, it sounds a little bit like what face masks are for keeping us safe against COVID. Emotional intelligence is for keeping us safe against, psychosocial factors that might lead to ill health. And of course, there's some problems in that analogy, but I think it's a good one. Left to our own devices, we just need to walk around for long enough, and without a mask, we'll get COVID. And without developing our emotional intelligence, we're probably going to be one of the statistics that's struggling with depression, anxiety, stress, etc., etc.
And our teams and our companies may be those statistics as well.
Yeah.
So if you would like to reach out to us to figure out how developing your emotional intelligence for yourself or for your team, or should I say, and for your team, can really impact the moment that we're in right now, but actually take us beyond this moment into a season of flourishing, then please reach out to us at hello@migro.me and we will pick up the conversation. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us in this series, and we look forward to engaging with you again in the future. Thanks so much.
Cheers.